All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going really deep, like to the foundations of like a massive global issue. We're tackling immigration.
Wow, yeah, diving right in.
And not just, popping over to Italy for a week of pasta and sightseeing. We're talking about the kind of move that's, intended to be permanent, uprooting and starting over in a whole new country.
Right, a life-altering decision, for
Yeah.
sure. And the philosophical heart of it all, which our source from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy really nails, is this. Do countries, do states actually have the moral right to say no to potential immigrants?
That's the core question, isn't it? And it's easy to just assume, of course, a country gets to decide who comes in. But as we'll see, that's just scratching the surface. Our source material lays out the ethical complexities around refugees, guest worker programs, what happens when wealthy nations recruit talent from poorer ones, what about those who immigrate without permission? What about the whole idea of choosing who to let in based on, like, skills or even cultural fit?
Yeah, all thorny issues with deep philosophical roots. So if you're listening, and you've probably encountered some heated debates around immigration, this deep dive is for you. We're going to go beyond the headlines, unpack the core philosophical arguments, and hopefully give you a solid framework for understanding it all.
So to kick things off, let's look at the arguments for why a state might have the right to close its borders. One big one revolves around culture, right? Like keeping a nation's distinct identity intact.
Exactly. David Miller, the political philosopher, really drives this point home. People have a vested interest in shaping their national identity, who they are as a people, and they want to see those values and traditions carried forward.
It's like, people feel connected to a shared story and they want to make sure that story continues. Our source uses a great example to illustrate this. Imagine potential immigration between the U.S. and Canada. Now compare that to, say, a hypothetical scenario of totally open borders between the U.S. and a country with drastically different cultural norms, like, well, I don't know, maybe somewhere with a totally different language, religion, social customs.
Yeah, the perception, and it's important to note that it's perception, is that the impact of the second scenario on culture would be much greater, potentially leading to, like, a feeling of displacement or even alienation among existing residents.
Right. It's not about saying one culture is better, but about how much change people feel comfortable with. But this raises so many questions. I mean, how do you even measure how much immigration actually changes a culture? And are these cultures we're trying to preserve even that unique or, unchanging in the first place?
Yeah.
Cultures evolve all the time, even without people moving around.
That's a crucial point. Cultures aren't frozen in time. And this leads to the big moral question. Just because people want things to stay the same, does that mean they have the moral right to shut others out? Does that desire trump the rights and needs of people trying to immigrate?
It's a big leap, ethically speaking.
Yeah.
And as our source points out, this argument, even if you accept it, would mostly just justify limiting immigration from groups that are super culturally different. It doesn't really support barring everyone.
Right, it doesn't justify a total shutdown of borders. Now, another major argument for restricting immigration focuses on the economy. The concern is that a big influx of immigrants could hurt the domestic economy.
The idea being more people competing for jobs, maybe driving down wages, especially for workers who are already struggling, right?
Yeah.
And our source brings up Medicine's arguments about how low-skilled workers might bear the brunt of this.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. And some argue that if those cultural differences we talked about were really significant, it could even affect, overall productivity. But here's the thing. Many economists argue that the big picture is more complicated. Sure, certain sectors or groups might feel the squeeze, but often the overall economy gets a boost from immigration.
New folks joining the workforce, often taking jobs that others don't want, plus they're buying stuff, stimulating the economy. And globally, research suggests that freer movement of labor would make the world richer overall.
The real philosophical question here, though, is about rights. Do domestic workers, especially those in low-paying jobs, have some kind of moral right to be shielded from competition caused by immigration?
And even if they do have that right, is the potential for some economic harm enough to slam the door shut on everyone?
Right. It's a tricky balancing act. Our source mentions how some governments help workers who lose jobs because of trade deals. Could something similar be done for those affected by immigration? If there were ways to soften the blow, that would take the wind out of the economic argument against immigration.
I mean, if you could make sure people weren't unfairly hurt, that changes things. The key takeaway here is that to shut down immigration based on economics, you'd have to prove not only that the economy would suffer, but also that people have an undeniable, unfixable moral right to be protected from those economic downsides.
Yeah, it's a high bar to clear. Now, there's another economic angle to this, especially for countries with big, generous welfare systems. The worry is that if they open the borders, tons of people from less wealthy places will come looking for those benefits, and the whole system will collapse.
It's hard to deny that a massive sudden influx of people could strain resources. But, libertarians might point to this and say, see, it's the welfare state itself that's the problem.
Right. They'd argue that restricting movement to protect a particular system is a bit backwards. But, there are middle ground solutions. Kukathas, for example, has this idea of delaying access to certain benefits for new immigrants. Like, they pay taxes, but don't get full access to social programs right away. It's a way to balance the potential strain on the system with the rights of the immigrants.
Yeah, like a gradual integration into the system. Of course, there are ethical concerns about how fair that is during the waiting period, but it shows that open borders in a welfare state aren't necessarily incompatible. And of course, this argument loses steam if a country doesn't even have a big welfare system.
Right. Context matters a lot in these discussions. So we've talked culture, economics. Let's move to the political side of things. This is where the idea of liberal nationalism comes in.
Okay, for those who haven't heard that term before, it basically means that liberal democracies, the kind with strong social safety nets, need a certain level of shared culture, a feeling of we're all in this together among citizens.
Exactly. The argument, especially for Miller, is that this shared sense of identity is what makes people willing to do things like pay taxes to support those safety nets or participate in the democratic process. Without it, things start to fall apart.
But is that really true? I mean, look at the U.S. and Canada, both successful liberal democracies with a ton of cultural diversity. They seem to be doing okay.
Yeah, and the argument also doesn't really deal with assimilation, the idea that over time immigrants adopt the values and norms of their new country. And even if there are some challenges, the big question remains, does that give us the right to exclude anyone who doesn't perfectly fit the mold?
Seems pretty extreme. It also brings up this question of whether current citizens have some kind of special right to protect their institutions, just because they share a culture. Pevnik argues that citizens, through their contributions and participation, have a type of ownership over their institutions.
Like they've earned the right to decide who gets to join. But Stills pushes back on that, saying the idea of owning political institutions just doesn't make sense, especially when we're talking about the basic structures of a society.
Right, can you really own democracy itself? Now, something that's become a big justification for restricting immigration, especially after 9/11, is national security.
Makes sense, right? After a major terrorist attack, there's this understandable urge to lock things down, control who comes in. But Kukathas points out that restricting legal immigration might not actually make things safer.
He says people who want to cause harm will find other ways in, whether it's smuggling themselves or coming in as tourists or students and then overstaying their visas.
Focusing on things like intelligence gathering and targeted security measures instead of just blanket restrictions might be more effective. It's about being smart and strategic, not just reactive.
Now, another big argument comes from the idea of political self-determination. This one's saying that deciding who comes in is part of a country's basic right to govern itself, like to choose who it associates with, kind of like a private club. Thinkers like Walzer, Pevnik, Song, and Wellman, they've all argued that if a state is legit, its freedom of association includes the right to say no to potential immigrants.
Yeah, it's like saying, we get to decide who's in our club. The logic is that, 1, states have a right to run their own affairs. 2, choosing who to associate with is part of that. And 3, not associating with someone means you have the right to exclude them.
Okay, so it's like comparing a country to, I don't know, a group of friends or a private club. But there are some problems with that analogy, as pointed out by folks like Fine and Cole. First off, can you really say that a country with all its power has the same moral rights as an individual?
Right, a country can wield much more force than a single person. And second, is refusing entry to potentially millions of people seeking safety or a better life really the same as me deciding I don't want to hang out with someone? The impact is so much bigger.
Yeah, the stakes are just completely different. Plus, when a country shuts someone out, it's not just saying we're not politically aligned, it's literally preventing them from entering a physical space, potentially denying them access to basic needs or safety.
It's a huge deal. And even if we accept that a legitimate state does have a kind of basic right to exclude people, it's not a blank check. That right can be overridden by other, more important moral concerns, like helping refugees or respecting family reunification. And it's worth noting that this argument mostly applies to states that are already considered legitimate, which opens up a whole other can of worms about what makes a state legitimate in the first place.
It's never as simple as it seems, is it? We also talked earlier about how some people use democracy as a reason to restrict immigration. But the funny thing is, you can also use democracy to argue for more open borders.
Yeah, Abizadeh makes a strong case for that. He's basically saying that excluding people without giving them a say is a huge contradiction in a democracy. He argues that anytime a state uses its power to coerce someone, which includes preventing them from entering, it needs to justify that to the people being coerced. So, since border control directly impacts potential immigrants, he says they should have a voice in shaping those policies.
I mean, that's a pretty radical idea, right? Giving non-citizens a say in immigration rules.
It definitely shakes things up. Critics like Miller argue that restricting immigration isn't really coercion in the sense that requires democratic justification. They say it's not like arresting someone, where we don't give the potential criminal a vote on the law. But Abizadeh's supporters counter that a country's power over territory is different from, say, my right to decide who can enter my house.
Makes sense. A country isn't just someone's private property, right? Now, another framework for thinking about all of this is the jurisdictional theory laid out by Blake. He argues that while states should respect everyone's human rights, their main duty to protect those rights is towards the people already within their borders.
It's like saying that we have limited resources and energy for protecting rights, so we focus on those closest to us, our own citizens. So if you just open the borders completely, it's like forcing a bunch of new responsibilities onto existing citizens without their say-so.
Right, like suddenly expanding the social contract without asking anyone. But Cates and Pevnik point out that we already have duties to protect each other's rights, even if we never formally agree to it. Like, it's just part of being in a society.
So they're saying, look, is taking on a similar duty towards newcomers really that different? They argue that it might just be a matter of scale, not a totally new kind of obligation.
But then, those who support the jurisdictional theory might say, hold on, newcomers shouldn't just get to increase our responsibilities without our consent. It's a worry about, like, overstretching the existing system.
And to that, Cates and Pevnik point out that immigrants aren't just taking, they're contributing too. They work, pay taxes, participate in the community. So it's not just a one-way street. And sometimes, especially when people are fleeing truly awful situations, their need for safety might outweigh the existing population's desire to avoid more responsibility.
It's a tough call, weighing those competing needs. Now, one perspective that's not as popular these days is the realist perspective.
Right. Realism in this context is basically saying that countries, when dealing with foreigners, aren't really bound by morality. They should just do whatever's best for themselves, so no obligation to open their borders.
Yeah, it's a very might makes right kind of view, very old school international relations. But even from a purely self-interested standpoint, it's not always clear that closed borders are the best move.
Exactly. Open borders can bring economic benefits, and they can align with, like, the property rights and freedom of association of a country's own citizens who want to interact with people from other countries. So even for those who are just thinking pragmatically, closing off completely might not be the smartest move.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on the arguments for restricting immigration. Now let's flip the script and look at the arguments for open borders. One of the biggest, most compelling ones comes from the perspective of cosmopolitan egalitarianism.
Yeah, this is a powerful one. It starts with the idea that all humans are equal in moral worth, no matter where they're born. And it then points out the harsh reality that where you're born has a huge impact on your life chances, like whether you'll have opportunities, a good education, healthcare, safety, all that.
It's often called the birth lottery, and it's not exactly a fair game. Cosmopolitan egalitarians, folks like Joseph Cairns, argue that closed borders are basically like inherited privileges, advantages that some people just get by luck while others get screwed over purely because of where they happen to be born.
And they see open borders as a matter of justice, not just charity. It's about righting that fundamental wrong of global inequality. But even within philosophy, there are some objections to this view. It often leans on a specific type of egalitarianism called luck egalitarianism, which focuses on fixing inequalities that come from things we can't control. Others might say that wealthy countries do have a duty to help the poor, but that can be done through things like foreign aid without necessarily opening the borders. They compare it to, like, how we expect rich people to help the poor in their own country, but we don't expect them to invite everyone into their homes.
Right, like there are other ways to address inequality without completely changing who belongs to a political community. And that brings back the whole freedom of association argument for states. Why some argue should a state be forced to open its political home just because there's inequality in the world?
It's a tough question. Now, another strong case for open borders comes from libertarianism, with its focus on individual freedom and limited government. Libertarians argue that immigration control violates the freedom of movement of those who want to immigrate and the property rights of those who want to welcome them.
So Karens argues that if an American landowner wants to hire workers from Mexico, the government stopping that is an infringement on the rights of both parties. It's about voluntary interactions between individuals.
Exactly. But even among libertarians, there's debate about whether this means completely open borders. Most agree that rights have limits. Like, my right to move freely doesn't mean I can just barge into your house. And property rights can be limited too, like zoning laws. So the question is, does an individual's right to invite someone onto their land automatically trump a community's right to decide who belongs?
It's about balancing individual rights with the rights of a political community. Now, we discussed how some folks use democracy to argue against open borders, but as you mentioned, some use it to argue for open borders.
Yeah, Abizadeh's argument is that excluding people without their consent directly contradicts a core democratic principle, the consent of the governed. He says that since border control affects potential immigrants, they should have a voice in creating those policies.
Pretty bold idea, right? Non-citizens voting on immigration.
It challenges traditional ideas of sovereignty and who gets to be part of the political process. Critics like Miller question whether restricting immigration is truly coercive in the sense that requires democratic justification. They use the example of law enforcement. We don't give criminals a vote on the laws they might break. But Abizadeh's supporters argue that controlling territory is different from controlling personal property. A country isn't just someone's private domain.
Right, it's a collective entity with responsibilities towards everyone within its borders, and even those seeking entry. Now, let's talk about the jurisdictional theory. Blake argues that states have a duty to respect everyone's human rights, but their strongest duty to protect those rights is towards their own citizens.
It's like saying we have to prioritize our own people. So open borders would be like forcing a bunch of new obligations onto existing citizens without asking them.
Right, like suddenly expanding who we're responsible for. But Cates and Pevnik counter that we already have obligations to protect each other's rights, even if we didn't specifically agree to it. It's part of the social contract.
They argue that taking on a similar duty towards newcomers might not be so different. It might just be a matter of scale, not a fundamental change in the kind of obligation we already have.
But then those who support the jurisdictional theory might say, wait, newcomers shouldn't just get to increase our responsibilities like that. They're concerned about the potential burden on the existing system.
And Cates and Pevnik would then point out that immigrants aren't just taking, they're contributing too. They work, pay taxes, participate in society. And sometimes the needs of those fleeing dire situations might outweigh the desire to avoid more responsibility.
It's a complex moral calculation. We've also got utilitarianism, which focuses on maximizing overall happiness and minimizing suffering. How did that view immigration?
Well, utilitarians generally see restrictions on movement as bad because they prevent people from going where they can be most productive and have the best lives. It's like putting up barriers to human potential.
It's like preventing resources from going where they're needed most, yeah. But, like with the economic arguments, there are counterpoints.
Some might argue that even if open borders create some economic benefits, the downsides for existing residents, like job competition or strain on services, could outweigh those benefits, leading to less overall happiness. Also, Miller, while not necessarily a strict utilitarian, argues that having a system of states with borders might actually contribute to overall well-being. It creates order and helps provide public goods. And then there's the idea that states have a right to organize themselves, even if it's not perfectly efficient globally, like how Norway chose not to join the EU, even though it might have meant some economic losses.
So even utilitarians disagree on the best approach. Finally, there's the human rights argument, which seems pretty strong in favor of open borders.
It's a powerful one. Proponents say that restricting immigration violates the fundamental right to freedom of movement. If a state prevents someone from moving to seek a better life, escape persecution, or be with their family, it's infringing on their basic rights.
But, as we discussed earlier, not everyone agrees on what the right to freedom of movement actually means. Does it mean you can go anywhere? Or just that you have enough options to move within a reasonable area?
That's the debate. Oberman argues that if human rights are supposed to protect our access to essential life options, then the right to immigrate is crucial. Where you're born shouldn't limit your choices so drastically. But Miller counters that international movement restrictions aren't usually designed to target specific groups and harm their human rights, unlike some domestic restrictions that might discriminate against certain groups. It's a complicated discussion.
So lots of back and forth on this one. Okay, we've explored a ton of arguments about whether states have the right to control their borders. Our source material also dives into some specific ethical issues related to immigration. First up, refugees. The 1951 Refugee Convention has a specific legal definition, but there are some ethical problems with it.
Yeah, Shaknov points out a few issues. One is that the definition mostly focuses on persecution because of things like race, religion, or political opinion. But what about people fleeing other horrible things like gender-based violence?
Mm.
Also, it leaves out people called economic refugees or those escaping chaos like civil war, even though their lives are in danger too. And the convention says you have to be outside your country to be a refugee, which makes it hard for people who are displaced within their country.
So the legal definition doesn't quite capture everyone who desperately needs help.
Right. Shaknov suggests this is because countries don't want to take on too much responsibility. But even with these debates, most people agree that refugees have a really strong moral claim for help, even those who favor stricter immigration policies. Fleeing persecution is seen as a much stronger reason to be let in than just wanting a better job.
But even if we agree that we should help refugees, does that always mean letting them into our country?
That's a key question. Some argue that our duty is to ensure refugees are safe, but not necessarily to give them permanent residency. The source mentions things like setting up safe zones in their region or giving financial aid to countries already hosting lots of refugees.
Right, there might be other ways to help without opening our own borders.
Now let's talk about guest worker programs, which were common in Western Europe. What were the main ethical problems with them? Walzer was a big critic of these programs. He pointed out that in places like West Germany, Turkish workers and their families could live and work for years, even decades, without getting full citizenship. This created a class of people who were economically useful but politically voiceless, vulnerable to exploitation.
So it's like they were good enough to work, but not good enough to have a say in the society they were contributing to.
Exactly. Walzer argued that if a country hires foreign workers for a long time, it has a duty to give them full citizenship eventually. The idea of a permanent underclass of non-citizens in a democracy was unacceptable to him. While many countries have changed their policies, some ethical questions remain, like how long is too long to work without equal rights? And what about the principle of volenti non fit injuria, the idea that if you agree to something, you can't complain later? If guest workers agree to limited rights, does that make it okay?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Does knowing the terms beforehand make it morally acceptable?
It raises questions about whether that consent was truly free and informed, especially when one side has a lot more power.
Another issue is wealthy countries recruiting skilled professionals from poorer countries, especially in areas like healthcare. Seems pretty problematic, right?
It definitely raises concerns about brain drain. The source uses the example of rich Western countries recruiting doctors and nurses from Africa, where there are already massive shortages of healthcare workers. Brock highlights the stark inequality. A tiny portion of the world has most of the doctors and nurses, while Africa, with a huge disease burden, has very few.
So while those doctors and nurses might benefit individually, their home country loses out big time.
Exactly. And given the human right to healthcare, this recruitment could be seen as undermining that right in those countries. One solution, though controversial, is banning emigration for these professionals, but that restricts their freedom. Brock suggests a better approach. The recruiting countries should compensate and help the originating countries train more healthcare workers.
A more balanced and ethical solution, I'd say. Now, what about irregular migrants, those who settle in a country without permission?
Kieran's raises an interesting question. If they stay long enough, build lives, and become part of the community, do they eventually gain a moral right to stay, even if they came illegally? It's the idea that their connection to the community becomes more important over time.
Like their roots grow deep, even if the beginning wasn't legal. It feels wrong to uproot people who've built a life somewhere.
Karen's is trying to capture that intuition, but some argue that just being somewhere a long time doesn't automatically give you rights. They compare it to stealing a famous painting. You might get attached to it, but it's still stolen.
Possession doesn't equal ownership.
Yeah.
And then there are kids brought here illegally by their parents. They didn't choose to come, so it's hard to punish them. But does that mean they automatically have a right to stay?
It's a tough one. A lot of moral factors to consider. Finally, let's tackle selection criteria. What ethical limits should countries have when deciding who to let in?
Beyond just using a lottery or waiting list,
Yeah.
right?
Countries use lots of criteria. Language, skills, sometimes even cultural fit. But the ethical red flag is when they start discriminating based on things like race, religion, or national origin. The White Australia policy is a prime example of that kind of racism. Walzer initially suggested that if a country wasn't overflowing with land, maybe racial exclusion wouldn't be so bad, which didn't go over well.
Yeah, that kind of thinking is pretty universally rejected nowadays.
Rightfully so. Even those who support border control generally agree that excluding people based on race is just wrong. Miller, while defending communal self-determination, says excluding based on race is just plain discrimination. Karen says that while private clubs can choose their members, the state has to treat everyone equally, especially when it comes to immigration. But there's debate about whether that distinction between public and private applies to people seeking entry. Blake adds that racist selection criteria are bad because they basically tell existing minority citizens that they're less desirable.
So while states have some leeway in choosing immigrants, discrimination, especially based on things like race, is a no-go.
Yeah, the ethical debate is about drawing that line between legitimate criteria and blatant discrimination.
Wow, this has been a seriously in-depth look at the philosophy of immigration. As we've seen, there are no easy answers. Each argument has its own complexities and counterarguments.
And it's important to remember that while many philosophers defend a state's right to control its borders to some extent, there's a lot of concern about how things are done in practice. The way we treat refugees, asylum seekers, and irregular migrants raises some serious ethical red flags.
It's something we need to keep thinking critically about. So here's a question for you, our listener. Given everything we've discussed, what principles do you think should guide immigration policies in the 21st century? It's a tough question, but a crucial one in today's world. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.